Hello, everybody, and today I'm going to be going through one of my favorite shows of all time, Attack on Titan, and I'm going to be mixing this up. Instead of going through the entire show and then rating it all at the end, I'm going to be going through all 89 episodes of the show and rating every single one to create an average. And I'll quickly explain my rating system before we get into the show. A 1 means that it has no redeeming qualities and does everything wrong. A 2 means that something has nothing good about it and does mostly everything bad. A 3 means that the cons far outweigh the pros. A 4 means that the cons outweigh the pros by just a bit. A 5 means that the pros and cons are balanced. A 6 means that the pros outweigh the cons by a little bit. A 7 means that the pros outweigh the cons by a good amount. An 8 means that the pros far outweigh the cons. And a 9 means that it has little to no cons, but it doesn't do everything it needed to do. And a 10 means that it did everything it needs to do. I would also like to add what I think an episode needs to be a 10 out of 10. It needs a good emotional resonance. It needs to have an impact on the show as a whole. For example, I can't give a 10 out of 10 to an episode that is just action and not much world building or character development happens. I also want to note that this will be my second watch of the show, so I'll make connections to future episodes during these episodes. So with all of that said, let's get into the first episode. You in 2000 Years / The Fall of Shiganshina. Damn, that is a mouthful of a name. From the beginning of this episode, you can tell that the show is going to be pretty good, with the Colossal Titan standing over them. But I just want to take this part to say that I think Season 1 is the absolute worst of the show. Still has a decent story, but compared to Season 2, 3, and 4, it completely falters. Those seasons are great. So I think this season will probably have the lowest scores throughout, so just remember that while I go through this video. But I do think this episode is decent. I think that it sets up the world almost perfectly. It does have some kind of cringy, stereotypical like anime stuff with holding with Hannes at the beginning of the episode. I also think that this season has the characters at their worst, Eren especially, because he's just basing and sometimes cringy for a chunk of the season. I think the best part of this episode is looking back, and it makes you realize how far everything goes in the future. I mean, look at the characters. Even some of the other stuff, like now you know what happened at starting with Eren seeing the future, and now you know where Eren's dad was going at the beginning of the episode when he leaves. But the part of this episode that got a lot of people hooked was when the Titans entered the city. They showed that the show could actually get decently dark, and it showed that the show was willing to do some more gory stuff. I also like the characterization of Hannes in this episode, with him being kind of a coward and leaving Eren and Mikasa' mom to die. I think that this is a 6 out of 10 because I think there are more good things than bad, but I think that if I were watching the show for the first time, I would have given it a 5 or maybe even a 4, because the later seasons make this episode way better because of the world building and everything surrounded his dad. But I didn't like a lot of stereotypical shonen stuff in this episode. And I'll mention it here, but the soundtrack in the show is so good. It matches the scenes perfectly. When there's a sad moment, the music fits perfectly. When there's a happy moment, the music fits perfectly. When there's a heroic moment, the music fits perfectly. But that said, let's move on to the next episode, That Day / The Fall of Shiganshina Part 2. Yeah, I think from the very start, it is better than the first episode, with, in my opinion, a better representation of what the Fall of Shiganshina would realistically be like, with them cramming everybody on boats and soldiers giving out food. It's all represented very good and nicely. I think that it had some of that kind of childish shonen stuff that I can't really stand, with all those like kind of annoying inspirational speeches from Eren. And again, it just shows how far the show goes with its themes and just how absolutely different it becomes, because by the middle of season 3 there is none of these like kind of weird stereotypical and cringy stuff that they do. But to be positive for a moment, I actually do really like Hannes' character, and his little rant at the beginning of this episode was probably one of the best scenes up to this point. I think that this episode is a really nice step up from the previous episode, so I'll be giving it a 7 out of 10. Now let's move on to the next episode, A Dim Light Amid Despair / Humanity's Comeback. Jesus, this show has very long titles. I really like this episode. It is another step up in my opinion. And again, it's carried heavily by knowing what happens in the future, because in this episode we meet the cast of characters, and I think that a lot of them are again made better by knowing how good they get. Because in this season they're good to okay and kind of forgettable, and like I've said before, just kind of like stereotypical shonen characters. We do get to see ODM gear in use at the very end though, and that's always cool. I also do like how this episode is unique, with it being all around the characters' experience at their training camp, and I do think that there was 2 characters I really like, and that was Bertolt and Reiner, and I think that they're good because you can tell that the writer knew exactly what he was going to do with them when he made them, and they're just different and pretty cool characters in general. With all that said, I still overall enjoyed this episode. Eren is getting better, and again, Bertolt and Reiner are really good. So I'll give this the same as last episode, 7 out of 10. Next up is another mouthful of a title, Night of Closing Ceremony / Humanity's Comeback Part 2. This is the second training-esque episode, but it focuses more on the actual characters and the starting of most of the characters being pretty good. I think this episode kind of makes John better as a character because you get to know his ideology a bit more, and I like that he acknowledges what he is. And I also liked the ending of this episode with Aaron's decision. And I do like the 2-year time jump too. I think that the whole thing with people joining the Scouts because Aaron was a bit stupid, it feels really out of character for a lot of characters. I think that they needed maybe an episode or two more just to show Aaron's influence on everybody at the training camp. Also, the ending of this episode is pretty good with the Colossal Titan returning, and it's this event that I believe marks a turning point in the series. So because of that, I'll give it another 7 out of 10. And speaking of the turning point in the series, I think that this episode was that turning point. The episode is another mouthful. Jesus, can we get a short name? Because the title is First Battle / The Attack on Trost Part 1. This episode marks the first time that something really bad happens in front of the characters and they just have to keep fighting. Not like in episode 1 where they all ran away from it. In this episode, they are forced to watch and see it all unfold, and that is what gives characters a lot more maturity. I mean, it doesn't completely fix them, but it does do a lot to further the characters into the characters they become later on in the series. This is more to set up the next episode, but seeing all the Scouts before this is really good, and it makes the aftermath really good. That's next episode. We are also introduced to Commander Pixis, who is a pretty cool character that's always in the background, and you get to know him pretty well throughout the series. And the real big thing that happened in this episode is Aaron being eaten by the Titan, which is an incredibly surprising and amazing moment that I love. I know a lot of people don't like it because it's a fake-out death, and I don't like most fake-out deaths, but unlike the fake-out deaths in, say, a story like Rise of Skywalker, in this one it actually furthers the plot and it makes sense. And it also does lead to next episode. It's also in this episode that we see the horror of somebody being eaten by a Titan, because unlike Aaron's mom who wanted to die, we see somebody who didn't want to die, and it is pretty sad. And it also just shows how horrific that would be to be in the mouth of something that is about to kill you. This episode also shows how unprepared the characters are for something like this. We also get the start of something that would affect Aaron for a long time. We see a flashback of Aaron and Armin where they talk about what's outside the walls, which is something that affects the whole rest of the show, because without Aaron learning about this, he probably would have never done any of the things throughout the series. This episode is extremely strong, so I'll give it a 8 out of 10. Then we get into where the show really gripped me, and that episode is called The World the Girl Saw / The Struggle for Trost Part 2. And this is where we see the aftermath of everything that happened in the last episode. And we see how Armin reacts to Aaron's death, which is made better by comparing it to his reaction to Aaron's actual death at the ending of the show. I also forgot that Krista and Ymir were in the first season, but I'm not going to talk about them until they actually become important. Another standout moment is when Armin finds this couple that had a few scenes from earlier, and one of them seems to have died and the other one is trying to revive him, even though it is hopeless. And this moment is just so great because it shows how that battle hasn't just affected our main cast, but it's also affected so many more people. I think that this scene is just great, and Armin's reaction to this makes it even better. Yeah, another amazing moment in this episode is we get to see Mikasa's backstory. We learn that her mom and dad were both killed by what seems to be like sex traffickers or something, but Aaron is there because his dad was there to check up on them because he's a doctor. And Aaron ends up being forced to kill 2 of the captors, and Mikasa's forced to kill the last guy. I love this scene because Aaron before this seemed like Mikasa was always protecting him, but this shows that Aaron kind of saved her life. And it's also where we see her get the scarf, which comes up later in the show, is like a representation of Aaron throughout the rest of the show. Overall, I wanted to give this episode a 10, but I don't think that's on the level of some of the episodes that I'll give a 10 later on in the video too. So for now, I'll give this episode a 9 out of 10. Now let's move on to The Tiniest of Blades, or The Struggle for Trost Part 3. This episode is also really strong. It sets out with seeing what everybody is doing, and we see somebody private panel themselves. We see everybody we didn't in the last episode. We see Mikasa react to Aaron's death, which is a pretty powerful scene. This entire scene is pretty miserable and just sad. That's why I think that it's really good. We're also introduced to Marco, who I think is a good character, but his death is great. He's basically the only person to ever be nice to John, and he has a death that, again, is amazing. But I'll get into that later. We also see Aaron's Titan for the first time, which is absolutely insane because it's probably the single most important event in the show, and it's a fantastic moment. It's one of the things that makes the show so special with the whole Titan shifters and stuff like that. And while there wasn't too much that went down in this episode, it was still really good. So I'll give this a 9 out of 10. That's a low 9, so not as good as last episode, but it was still really good. So let's move on to I Can Hear His Heartbeat, or The Struggle for Trust Part 4. This episode revolves around the group trying to get Aaron's Titan to the headquarters so he can kill the Titans attacking that place. And while one group does this, John leads his group to headquarters to get a drop on the Titan. I think that John is one of the best characters in this show, especially in this Trust arc and season 1 as a whole, because his concept is that he's not really fit to lead the group, but he kind of has to. And it leads to a lot of really good moments with him. Like this part where he sees everybody running away from the Titans, but he freezes and we hear his inner monologue. But after that, there isn't really many more character moments. It's really just planning, which is fine. And I mean, the action in this show is decent, but I don't really care for action all that much. And I think that the story is by far the best part of this show. And to me, that's the most important part of any media that can tell a story. And yes, controversial take, that includes games. But takes that will get an angry mob at me aside. The one other scene that I do really like in this episode is John and Marco talking while reloading their guns or whatever they were doing there. That's why I like John's character so much, because Marco's basically like the first person who's really that nice to him. I don't hate the ending of this episode with everybody seeing that the Titan was Aaron, but I think that this episode is quite the downgrade from the last few. It wasn't horrible, I just didn't like that it didn't have like nearly as many emotional moments as the last few episodes. So I'll give this episode a 7 out of 10. It has good moments and the action is good, just too much. Now let's get into what happened to his left arm, or the attack on Trust, part 5. It's in this episode where we're introduced to Levi's squad, who like the other characters grow on you throughout the entire show. We're also introduced to Erwin, who is a character that's consistently good throughout the show, but he gets really fleshed out later on. I do like the scene where we see Aaron transform. It's the first time he does it, and it's something that we see him do a lot in the future. Then there's the scene with a bunch of soldiers surrounding Aaron, Mikasa, and Armin, threatening to kill them because Aaron could be a Titan. This scene is tense and very good. I think that seeing the character's mindset under a situation like this is really, really cool, and I love seeing Aaron's thought process throughout this scene. It is just really good. And then it ends with Aaron turning into a Titan to protect his friends. I think this episode was really, really good. I like seeing how everybody reacts to Aaron turning into a Titan, so I'll give this episode an 8 out of 10. The next episode is called Response or the Struggle for Trust Part 6, which is essentially an episode where everybody responds and reacts to what happened recently. We pick up where the last one left off. And again, the scene is pretty tense. I think this episode showcases what Armin is good in, what situations he is useful, which I like because up until this point he hasn't done much, and in this episode they use his intellect and persuasion techniques to almost get out of a situation before Pixis has to save them. I like how this shows just how pathetic and worthless everybody is, because they're just about to cower in fear and kill 3 innocent children and doom the future of research and killing something that could really help them out, all because they're scared of Aaron and don't fully understand what he's capable of. This is also where Aaron starts wanting to open up the cellar, which is something that comes up later. There's another scene that shows that Armin isn't useless, where he comes up with a plan to save Trust, and this episode is also extremely strong. I believe that showed just how awful the people in this show are and how little choice Aaron really does have in anything, which he really doesn't have the entire show, even with the power he has. So I'll give this episode an 8 out of 10, and that is teetering on a 9. Then we move on to the next episode, Idol or the Attack on Trust Part 7. This episode is about laying out the plan that Armin made in the last episode, where Aaron in Titan form will take a boulder and cover up the part of the wall that got destroyed. And the scene where the scouts are informed that they are going to have to attempt to retake Trust is amazing, because I would probably act the same after all of them barely making it out alive and making it out with severe trauma, and then they're told they have to go back mere hours later. The scene articulates just how awful that would be, and again, I'd probably act the same in all honesty. The episode helps Pixis' character because he's a good leader because of how he takes everybody into account when he offers to let people stay if they want to help, but they can leave if they want, just because of how awful what happened before. And by him doing that, he's eliminated a lot of people who would have either just hidden until inevitably being eaten, or people who would have killed themselves. I did not entirely like the ending of this episode, though, with Aaron trying to kill Mikasa, because, I don't know, again, in the moment he was frustrated with her, but it doesn't seem like something he'd do, and this episode is still really, really good, so I will give it another 8 out of 10. Next up is Flaw or Attack on Trust Part. I still really don't understand the thing with Aaron trying to kill Mikasa. It's just that, like, it doesn't really seem like something he'd do, and he never really attempts to kill someone or something that he doesn't want to, like, ever again. And in the last episode, it makes it very clear Aaron would not want Mikasa dead. So why the hell is he doing this? We never really get the answer, so it really just doesn't make much sense. But the rest of the episode is okay. There is, again, too much action in it. It's really just a lot of killing Titans until Armin tries to wake up Aaron, and we do get this pretty good scene with Aaron that I do like a lot. The moment with John saving Connie was pretty cool. It shows how far his character has gone since the beginning of the show. He would never done something like that, so it was a cool moment. Armin waking Aaron up was also like a good moment, and the end of this episode is good, but not great, because Most of it was spent on action, but the good moments were good, so I'll give this episode a 7 out of 10. The next episode is Primal Desire, or the Attack on Trust, Part 9, and it's in this episode that the series begins to pick up steam again. Not in the first half, because the first half is just a bunch of action and some alright emotional moments, and the monologue with Aaron talking about freedom is made way better by watching the whole show, because in the end, he doesn't really ever get freedom. But where this episode really shines is in the last third or so, because when they reclaimed trust, it was like a whole heroic moment when it happened. But then when you see the cleanup of what happened, it's kind of sad, and you see everybody who died and was horribly eaten or crushed. It shows even when there is considered a win for humanity, it still comes at a great cost. And by far the best part of the episode was when John finds Marco dead, because this is the first of many characters that we get to know that die, and having John find his dead body and essentially being just told to get back to work afterwards is heartbreaking and one of the most sad moments in the show. It's also made a lot more tragic in the future when it's revealed how he died, but that's a long time from. The whole cleanup scene in general is just absolutely amazing, and then the ending is also really good when Aaron gets a place on the scout, but the people he trusted also lock him in a cage, even when he had just given them one of their biggest wins in years upon years. This episode is amazing, and I was thinking about giving this episode a 10, but the first half of the episode is still just alright, so I'll have to knock it down a point, so 9 out. Now we get into an episode that feels like a total switch for the series. It goes from big battle to another to what will happen for the rest of the series, which is a lot of world building, character building, and emotional and surprising moments. And this episode doesn't have all of those, but it feels like it's when they're so switched to wanting that. They even changed the whole intro. The episode is called Still Can't Look at Him in the Eye, or Eve of the Counterattack Part 1. The plot of this episode is that Aaron might be sent to death for his Titan abilities. A small gripe that I have for this episode is that it introduces Hanji. While the character grows on you, in this season she kind of sucks. She acts like a stereotypical kind of like, I don't know how to describe it. It feels stereotypical, and it's just all around just bad. And I don't even like her interactions with Levi this season, which specifically is funny because by the time she dies, her last interaction with Levi is really, really good. But she's not terrible in this episode because she doesn't really have much of a role in it. This episode is mostly spent in a courtroom deciding if Aaron should be killed or not, and it is an amazing episode. Everything about it is just great. The emotional character moments are really, really good, especially the stuff between Mikasa and Aaron. I think that this is a turning point for Mikasa too. I think that every character has a point in the show where the character becomes like way, way better. And this is where Mikasa goes from a good character to a great character, in my opinion. From this point onward, she goes from a character that just protects Aaron and doesn't really show many emotions to a character that has more traits than just protecting Aaron. So that's also really good part of this episode. Then there is the ending, which is great. It showcases Levi's character and how he operates and how he's actually pretty good at persuasion when the judges assign Aaron to be watched over by the scouts. So yeah, this is another amazing episode, 8 out of 10. Let's get into the Special Operations Squad / Eve of the Counterattack Part 2. This episode is where we get to know Levi's squad, and I think that they're decent overall. We don't really get to know them all that well because of the events that happen in later episodes, but I still like them. Except for this weird dude, I can't stand him. Most of them are good to okay, and they didn't really get on my nerves. Like I said earlier, Hanji is still really, really annoying this season, and that applies tenfold to this episode because she probably has the most screen time out of all the characters other than Aaron this episode. But that's really it for this. Not much really happens. 6 out of 10. Most of the pre-Hanji stuff was pretty good, but the stuff with her was kind of annoying. Now let's move into What Should I Do Next / Eve of the Counterattack Part 3. This episode is focused on the preparation for the 57th expedition, which is pretty good. I like the scene at the beginning where Connie notices that John wants to join the scouts and he decides to do it, but ends up regretting it later on. Also, John reflecting on Marco was really, really good, and I liked all of the other characters' reaction to him doing it. I also like the scene where everybody becomes a scout. After that point, they begin planning for the 57th expedition. John seems to be a bit hesitant towards Aaron because of what happened with him attacking Mikasa when they were going to retake trust, and he makes it very obvious he does not trust Aaron. He kind of says what everybody else in that room was thinking, and then it ends with them starting the expedition. This episode was pretty good. I think John was an absolute standout in it, so I'll give this an 8 out of 10. Then we have the Female Titan / the 57th Expedition Part 1. This is another game changer for the series because it's the first time that the Female Titan is in the show, which is a Titan that makes it to the end of the show, and it's the first Titan shifter that they know of at the time in this episode that Aaron goes up against. But Aaron doesn't meet her this episode. This episode is about how everybody except for Levi's squad reacted to it. I do have some gripes with the Female Titan's character, at least for this season. I'll just say this. Her character is way better in season 4, and it's pretty obvious that the female Titan is Annie, just based on how the character that. And it's pretty obvious that the female Titan is Annie. What character seems like they have the least amount of care for humanity? Oh, it's Annie, and it turns out that I am correct with that assumption. But it is cool to see a Titan that has a goal. It is also cool to see how the characters react to this. But that's really all that happens in this episode, so 7 out of 10, just not much happens. The next episode is kind of same for that exact reason. It's mainly just reactions to what happened. The episode is called The Forest of Giant Trees, or the 47th Expedition Part 2. I did like the starting. It kind of tapped into a comedic side of the show that was kind of nice because it almost never happens again. And it managed to be kind of funny, and it's followed by a scene of brutal murder. It mostly just shows the female Titan killing people. And at this point in the show, she's pretty scary, but compared to stuff like the Beast Titan and the Founding Titan later on, she seems kind of insufficient and useless. I also like the scenes with Eren and Levi's squad where they wonder why they're actually doing what they're doing. I also liked Armin and John in the trees. I think that their chemistry is just really, really good. The ending is pretty good with the female Titan running into Eren and Levi's squad, which is something that everybody was waiting for to happen, but ends up on a cliffhanger. So I'll give this episode the same score as the last one, 7 out of 10. Good, but still kind of uneventful. Next up is Bite / the 57th Expedition Part 3, and this episode is kind of a step down from the last two. It starts out with Levi's squad kind of being douchebags and telling Eren to literally let 3 people be brutally murdered by the female Titan, which is kind of unforgivable, and they really don't have a reason other than they really just don't feel like fighting her. And then there's a flashback with Hanji, so it is really annoying. Levi's squad also just jumped at the opportunity to kill a 14-year-old. Also, them gaining trust in Eren is kind of just random, and it didn't feel earned. I was fine with Levi in this though, but one good character doesn't excuse the other ones. This is the only episode that I'll give a below average score to, 4 out of 10. Next episode is Erwin Smith / the 57th Expedition Part 4. It's a definite step up from the last episode. It starts out showing what John and Armin are doing, and they talk about what they think happened, which I like. I also like the scene with Eren talking to Levi's squad. It was good, and his squad is actually pretty good outside the last episode. Well, except for this guy. God, this guy gets on my nerves. But the other ones are pretty good. And the stuff with Erwin was really good too. It showed off how good he is at quick thinking, and Levi talking to the female Titan was also pretty good. And the new abilities showcased in this were actually pretty cool, and why does this stupid guy have to ruin everything? But I'll give this a 7 out of 10. Next is Iron Hammer / the 57th Expedition Part 5. This episode is amazing. It starts out with Levi's squad being killed by the female Titan, and I weirdly felt bad for them. Even this guy, who I hated ever since he was introduced. I think the reason I felt bad for a character that I really don't like is because how he dies. They all die pretty horribly, but he watches all of his friends die only to be killed horribly after that. The next scene with Eren fighting the female Titan is pretty good, because seeing what Eren is thinking throughout the fight is really good. I don't like big battles in terms of visual battles. I like more fast battles between two people, but if it has emotion, I don't really care what type of battle it is. And this scene had a lot of emotion with Eren's inner monologue. The ending is also really good with Mikasa finding Eren being eaten. It was a really good scene ending off with Levi and finding Mikasa after seeing his entire team dead. You can tell what he's seen has kind of haunted him. Overall, this episode is amazing. I was thinking of giving it a 10 out of 10. But again, later on there will be episodes that I give a 10 to that are way better than this episode, so I'll settle with a 9 out of 10. The next episode is called The Defeated / the 57th Expedition Part 6. The first half is spent finishing up the 57th Expedition, and it's really good. I found it to be really cool seeing the two most skilled characters working together, and it was definitely a bit weird on the first watch when they find Eren's body in the female Titan's mouth. And seeing it get absolutely destroyed is really, really satisfying after everything that's happened up to this point. I really like the scene of everyone lining up the dead bodies. You can tell what Levi is feeling even without seeing his face or hearing dialogue when he looks at his squad's dead bodies. John and Armin's chat was really good, and even Connie and Sasha's chat was really good, even if their characters I don't really feel a connection with yet, because they also have a point where they become interesting later on. You really get the impression on how much this event has shaken up the characters. Also, the scene where Levi hands the guy his dead friend's badge is really good because it shows you that people who aren't part of the main group are also suffering. The scene of showing Eren in the first episode watching the scouts return, and then you see how he is after joining the scouts and seeing the kids look up at him is just amazing. Also, the scene with Petra's father was absolutely heartbreaking. It's probably one of the saddest scenes up to this point. Seeing Levi's face while he's listening to her dad talk about how he's excited to see her again, knowing that he's going to have to tell him that she's dead, is incredibly sad. Also, hearing that they seem to have feelings for each other also just makes it sadder. Seeing everybody bombard the scouts after they just experienced something awful and heartbreaking is what makes this episode the first 10 out of 10 in the series for me. The next episode is about Annie, and it's not just about her, it's about what it's like in the most protected part of the city, aka the Stonehouse district, and seeing how different the people are, and how much they look down on the scouts. It makes you kind of mad. We are also introduced to Marlo and Hitch, who are two of my favorite characters in the show. They have an amazing character arc. Also, Marlo dies in one of the best scenes of all time, in my opinion, but that's not until season 3. But their chemistry is pretty good, even in this episode. I like the scene where Marlo breaks down, realizing how awful pretty much everybody around him is. The one thing I don't like in this episode is Annie, because I don't really like her character in general, and it's this episode that's trying to get you to care for her, so what's about to happen has a bigger impact on you, but she just acts like an edgy teen who thinks that they are so deep. So the episode fails miserably at that, and that made the reveal of the female Titan have way less impact on it. On top of it was really, really obvious. I did like that they set up a plan to figure out it was her, and the reactions were also pretty good. So I think that this episode has some good parts, but it's not great overall, so I'll give this a 7 out of 10. And now it's time for the penultimate episode of the series, Mercy / the Stonehouse District Raid Part 2. I thought that starting scene was pretty good with them making the plan to prove Annie was the female Titan. The scene of Armin, Eren, and Mikasa running away from Annie was also pretty good, and the scenes of reaction were, again, good. But again, a lot of the emotional scenes were ruined because Annie isn't really that good of a character, and I think that this showed off Armin and Mikasa's characters, because Mikasa is just protecting Eren at all costs, and Armin is thinking of a plan. It's nice that they get some time to shine, and that's really all that happened in this episode, so I'll give it a 7 out of 10. There's just not too much that really happens. So now we move on to Wall / Attack on Stonehouse Part 3, and this episode is decent. I think that's the worst final episode of a season in the show, but that's because they have some really good last episodes later on, so that's not saying that this one is bad. But this one was a lot of action, which was kind of disappointing, but seeing everybody come together to beat one Titan was really good, and the MPs meeting Erwin was also really good. Erwin is just such an amazing character, and this showed why he is so great, and that is because he is one of the most heartless but also driven characters in the show. I think that all the stuff after Eren v. Annie was really good. Erwin's trial with the council was good, and everyone visiting Eren was great. His chat with Mikasa especially was really good, and it foreshadows the next seasons heavily. And you don't understand why the show decided to zoom onto the birds until you finish the show. And I'm not really a huge fan of the strange cliffhanger this episode, but overall it was really good when it wasn't focusing on action. But again, a large portion of it was spent on the action, and it would have easily been better if I liked Annie more. But yeah, after they beat her, it was really good. So I'll give this episode an 8 out of 10. And that's it. Overall, I rated 1 episode a 4 out of 10, 3 episodes a 6 out of 10, 7 episodes a 7 out of 10, 7 episodes an 8 out of 10, 6 episodes a 9 out of 10, and 1 episode a 10 out of 10. That all adds up to 191 divided by 25, which is the number of episodes, make an average of 7.64, and rounding that up makes an average of 8 out of 10. And now for some other stuff I want to do every season, just to see how things change. My 5 favorite characters this season were John, Armin, Mikasa, Eren, and Levi. My least favorite episode of this season was Season 1, Episode 19, Bite / the 57th Expedition Part 3, and my favorite was Defeated / the 57th Expedition Part 6, and overall I would rate this season a 7 or 8 out of 10. And that's a wrap. See you guys in the Season 2 video.